anymore. Secondly, the church is supported by, as opposed to being persecuted by, the imperial authority. Now, last time, what we basically looked at is a kind of narrative and a kind of list of important sorts of changes that took place within Christianity during this time. What I want to focus on in this lecture is two things. First of all, the development of the papal office, and secondly, the emergence of the most fundamentally important list of Catholic and Christian doctrines that's ever been developed, the fundamental ones upon which others really are built. So let's start with the papal office. Now, one thing to say is that the word pope did not originally refer only to the Bishop of Rome. It was used to refer to other leaders of the church as well. And in fact, today, in the Coptic church in Egypt, their leader is still referred to by the Copts as their pope. But by the 5th century or so, at least in the West, the term pope had come to be used exclusively for the Bishop of Rome. So for Catholics, Bishop of Rome and pope are really interchangeable terms. It's important to remember that, and I will use both of those terms during the rest of our lectures, our time together talking about the Catholic Church. Obviously, and we've talked about this at the very beginning of the course, that the papal office is rooted in a tradition that traces that authority all the way back to St. Peter. And it is important to remember that there is indeed good evidence that Peter came to Rome, although he did not found the Christian community there, and that he died at the Vatican. By the way, I want to remind you once again, we don't know who founded the Christian community in Rome. Boy, if we could ever turn up a document that would tell us that, it would unveil a lot of the mystery of early Christianity. When Peter did come to Rome, we don't know exactly what position he held within the Christian community there. That is to say, we don't have any internal documents that talk about how that community functioned, either without or with Peter. But certainly, given Peter's special role among the apostles, it's hard to imagine that Peter wasn't the leader, not in some institutional way, but that Peter wasn't the natural leader of the Christian community in Rome. So, although it is hard to trace how we get from Peter to the 4th century, nevertheless, we have the names of his successors all the way through. Sometimes we aren't sure of exact dates. Sometimes we aren't even sure of names. Sometimes there are conflicting records because we have no contemporary records of the bishops of Rome, let's say in the later 1st century or in the 2nd century or even part of the 3rd century. So the history is not as precise and clear as sometimes the list of papal names would make it. But nevertheless, obviously Catholics believe in that continuity, even though we can't talk about it in great historical detail, that continuity from Peter to the time when the bishops of Rome become public figures and we get to know them better in the 4th century. But let me suggest that as early as the 2nd century, we have good evidence for a certain special importance that the Bishop of Rome has. For example, we need to remember Rome was the center of the world. And we need to remember that the community of Rome, the Christian community, was associated with both Peter and Paul. Now think about that. Peter, in some ways, especially, was the apostle to the Jews, and Paul calls himself the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, Jews plus Gentiles equal everybody. And therefore, the two greatest carriers of the good news from the generation after the time of Jesus both came to Rome, both died in Rome, and their shrines, their remains, were and are in Rome. And so we have a document from the 2nd century that suggests to bishops, if you are having a problem that you can't solve, ask the Bishop of Rome. That there's a special place for the Bishop of Rome in perhaps being the go-to guy. This was not a jurisdictional claim, submit it to Rome because Rome has jurisdiction. It is, that's the natural place to turn to deal with problems that seem to be intractable where you are. The term that we very often use, a Latin term, to describe this view of the Bishop of Rome is that he is primus inter pares, which is Latin for first among equals. And that's perhaps a good way of thinking about the bishops of Rome in the centuries leading up to the 4th century when Christianity changes so radically. Now, let me for a minute just review what I've said about Constantine and the 4th century and the papal office. First of all, I suggested that Constantine gave a palace, the Lateran Palace, to the Bishop of Rome. Secondly, the Pope sponsored the building of certain churches, including St. John, the Emperor, sponsored these, including St. John Lateran. And therefore, it becomes the Cathedral of Rome. And let me remind you also that although there is this legend we often read about Constantine also giving certain kinds of political authority to the Bishop of Rome, we need to discount that historically because we now know that that story was created in the middle of the 8th century. We've also seen that in the 4th century, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, took on some of the trappings of ancient pagan Rome, including the title of Pontifex Maximus. The most important development that we can pinpoint in the continuing growth of the papal office is from the year 451. The Pope is Leo I, one of the few popes referred to also as the Great. As it turns out, in the year 451, there was an ecumenical council, the Fourth Council, held in Chalcedon. More about that in a minute. The Pope did not attend that council, but he had an opinion about what the council should do. And he wrote a letter laying out what his position is, a position, by the way, that was adopted by the Fourth Ecumenical Council. But in that letter that he wrote, which we call the Tome, T-O-M-E, of Leo, he writes this: Peter speaks through Leo. Those are very important words. Peter speaks through Leo. So what the Pope is claiming, what Leo says is, any authority that Jesus gave to Peter is inherited by Peter's successors, the popes. And that leads us back to the Gospels. What are the special things that Jesus said only to Peter? I mentioned them briefly in Lecture 1. Now it's time to recap them in this context. First and foremost is Matthew 16. You are Peter the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I give to you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. That's why on the papal coat of arms you will see the crossed keys. And by the way, if you walk into St. Peter's in Rome today and look at the base of Michelangelo's wonderful dome, in great big letters, many feet high, it has this exact quotation from Matthew, of course in Latin, Tu es Petrus et super hanc Petram edificabo ecclesiam meam. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So that's what you will read if you look up into Michelangelo's dome today. Secondly, there's a passage in Luke 22 that takes place during the time when Jesus is arrested. And Jesus says to Peter, Peter, I pray for you that your faith may never fail. Third, there's a passage in John 21. This is a post-resurrection story where Jesus tells Peter to feed my sheep. So clearly, if we take the Gospels to be more or less historical, Peter is singled out by Jesus. Jesus says other things to the apostles generally, and occasionally something to a group of apostles. But Jesus says these things only to Peter. And so what Leo says is all those things, all those pieces of authority that Jesus gave to Peter, I, Leo, have today in the church because I am the successor of Peter. That's what it means to be Bishop of Rome. I do want to note, however, because sometimes this gets confusing, that what Leo is claiming is jurisdiction. He is not claiming what we would call personal infallibility. And these two things are not unrelated, but they're not the same. And we will see when we discuss it in great detail what papal infallibility means in Lecture 29 when we look at the declaration of the First Vatican Council on papal infallibility, which took place in 1870. We'll talk about that then. But right now we're looking at a statement about jurisdiction. What the Pope is saying is, I have some sort of jurisdiction over all Christians, not just the Christians in my diocese. I am sort of a bishop of the bishops, if you will. It is not a claim to some sort of royal authority. It is not a claim about secular authority. It is not even a claim of personal infallibility. It is a jurisdictional claim. And of course, as we know, even today, one of the disputes between Catholics and other Christians, especially the Orthodox and the Anglicans, has to do with the claim of papal jurisdiction. That claim is really, carefully laid out for the first time in the Tome of Leo in 451. I also want to add as a kind of footnote to this discussion that toward the end of the 5th century, a pope named Gelasius I wrote that there is a distinction between papal authority and imperial power. Okay, notice he uses different words: papal authority, imperial power, suggesting that there's some qualitative difference between the authority of the Bishop of Rome and the authority of the emperor. And I'm going to suggest that in later centuries, this distinction will be used when popes do, for a while in the Middle Ages, make the claim to have some sort of political authority all over Christendom, as well as spiritual jurisdictional authority. So just be aware of that Gelasian distinction, and that it's going to be used in the arguments that we're going to look at when we deal with the medieval papacy. Now, I want to turn to some of the doctrinal problems that Christians dealt with in the 4th century. And I want to pick up first with one I've mentioned a couple times before. You probably said, when the hell's Cook ever going to get to this thing he keeps saying he's going to talk about later? And that's this question about whether people who surrender their books and get their certificate of sacrifice during the persecution can come back into the Christian community, in particular, can come back as office holders. In particular, what if a bishop did that? Is he still a bishop when the persecution is over? And the movement that said, no, he isn't, we call by the name Donatist. And the Donatist controversy took place in North Africa in the decades immediately following the end of the persecution, during the reign of Constantine. And there was a synod that was held, a group of bishops in North Africa, and they decided that the Donatists were wrong, because the validity of an office holder is not based on his personal goodness, but rather is based on the official handing over of power to him. It's a matter of process. It's not a matter of character that determines who the bishop is. Now, the Donatist controversy didn't go away. Constantine dealt with it. In fact, a century later, St. Augustine is still dealing with it in North Africa, which again was the center of Donatism. But let me suggest why this decision is so vitally important for the development of Christianity. Let's say that you make the argument the Donatists do. If somebody is a bad character, if somebody does horrible things as bishop, then he's not bishop. Then all that ordination stuff is invalid. And that he is not bishop because he has essentially relinquished the office of bishop when he has shown bad character. Now let's imagine this. A bishop dies. 10 years later, let's say, we find out horrible things that this bishop did. Horrible things. Well, if he did horrible things, then he's not bishop any longer. But wait a minute. That means the priests that he ordained aren't really priests because he wasn't really a bishop. In other words, if you follow the Donatist argument, the institutions of the church simply are chaotic. You just can't trust anything. Because if my priest wasn't ordained by a real bishop, then he wasn't a real priest, then he doesn't really consecrate the bread and the wine, then I haven't really received the Eucharist. You see how all this goes. So this decision about Donatism was a vitally important one. And I want to suggest it is important because, in part, we need to understand that in the early days of Christianity, simply being a Christian meant that you were subject to persecution, whether it's local in the very earliest times or whether it's empire-wide later on. So it really was a small body, but everybody who belonged was committed. If you will, to put it in somewhat different language, it was a community of saints. But now, of course, in the 4th century, lots of people are joining, and many of them, no doubt, are, in some ways, lukewarm. After all, it's the religion of the emperor now that you're joining. And so what we have to deal with is this larger transition from a small church, a body of saints, people who are willing to put their lives on the line, almost by definition of being Christian, to this large body that over time is going to be more or less coterminous with the Roman Empire, but it's no longer a community of saints. There are a lot of wishy-washy people. There are a lot of people who go through the motions. There are a lot of people who certainly wouldn't sacrifice their lives. So we need to realize this 4th century is a transition from being a church of a committed few to a large, large church. And like so many other things, you gain a lot of things as the church grows, and the community and the kind of community it is changes and must change in order to absorb the changes of that magnitude that take place in the 4th century. Now, I want to turn to the fact that we have in the 4th and 5th century a number of very important theological arguments that are going to have to get settled, ones that really tear Christians apart. Let's start with the first kind of problem. We've got God the Father and the claim of the divinity of Jesus, God the Son. What's exactly their relationship? Are they exactly the same thing? Are they sort of the same and sort of different? Are there more differences and similarities between the man Jesus and God the Father, the creator of heaven and earth? These are difficult theological questions. And the question became an empire-wide question in the early 4th century when a priest from Alexandria in Egypt named Arius developed a belief that suggested Jesus wasn't creator or part of the creator. He was the first thing God created. However good a guy Jesus was, however holy and wonderful Jesus is, there was, Arius wrote, a time when Christ was not. He is not co-eternal with the Father. Arius, I think it's fair to say, feared that saying that Jesus is eternal sort of threatened the monotheistic thrust of Christianity and, of course, its root religion of Judaism. So Arius argued there was a time when Christ was not, and this became such a controversy that in 325, Constantine called a council of all the bishops of the inhabited world, the ecumenical council, the first ecumenical council at Nicaea. Nicaea is the modern Turkish city of Iznik, not too far from Istanbul. And it was there that the bishops hammered out a statement of belief, that is to say, a creed. And because the creed was hammered out in Nicaea, we call it the Nicene Creed. And of course, for Catholics and for many Protestants and for Orthodox as well, recognize that as the creed we say in church all the time. Catholics every week, for example. And so what is it exactly that the Nicene Creed says that addresses this problem of Arius? It says that Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one in being with the Father. That is the Nicene formula in understanding the relationship of God the Father, the creator of heaven and earth, to God the Son. And it rejects the Arian position. And virtually all the bishops who were at the Council of Nicaea signed this formula. However, some of them, almost as soon as they got back to their diocese, sort of reverted to a more Arian position. In other words, as always happens, you have a controversy, You have a settlement, but the settlement doesn't really settle everything. The people who were opponents don't necessarily all go away and say, shucks, we were wrong, let's forget about that and sign on. And even some of the bishops who signed on at Nicaea essentially signed off shortly after they got back home. And by the way, one of those bishops baptized Constantine, and it was Arian bishops who deeply influenced the policies of Constantine's three sons, all of whom succeeded him as emperor. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, also there were, this is not quite the right word, but it'll have to do, sort of missionaries of the Arians who went outside the Roman Empire. And they converted certain Germanic tribes, including the Goths. So as I mentioned, when the Goths invaded the Roman Empire in the 4th century, they were not just the political enemies from time to time of the Roman Empire, but they were also, if you will, the wrong kind of Christians. They were the kinds of Christians whose teachings had been rejected by the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea. And so there's going to be a period of several centuries in which Germanic tribesmen are entering the Roman Empire. From the point of view of most bishops, they come not just as political enemies, but as heretics. And we'll be following that story when we look at the Germanic invasions into Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. A second council was called in the year 381 in the city of Constantinople. And this council was called, at least in part, to reaffirm the Nicene Creed. Because, as I'd suggested, Constantine's three sons, who had ruled almost up to that time, had been favorable to the Arian position, as was an emperor who had died as recently as 378. So we have a situation where primarily what the Council of Constantinople does is to reaffirm Nicaea, but it also develops and expands the Nicene Creed to talk more about the Holy Spirit. We need to remember, I've said this before, that the word Trinity does not appear in the Bible. And what Constantinople adds to our Catholic and Christian teaching is really a complete definition of the Trinity. God the Father is God, God the Son is God, and God the Holy Spirit is God. And in fact, what Christians say today that we call the Nicene Creed is really the Nicene Constantinople Creed. That is to say, the Nicene Creed as expanded a little bit, especially with regard to the Holy Spirit. So we really have this sort of finally thorough, complete, unequivocal Trinitarian statement about the nature of the Christian God that develops out of the Council of Constantinople. In the early 5th century, a new set of issues come up. And that is, think about this, Jesus is human and Jesus is divine. How do we understand that? This is not an easy question. I always say this to my students. We'll have a little exercise here, okay? Take the word human and write a list of things that you think about that you associate with being human. Now, take the word God and make a list of attributes of God. Those lists don't fit together very well, like partial and whole, mortal and immortal, and it goes on and on and on. So there is this teaching that we had in the first two ecumenical councils that Jesus was God. What exactly does it mean to have a God in human form? How do we understand, this is the way perhaps the question can be phrased, how do we understand the relationship between Jesus' humanity and Jesus' divinity? And that is the primary subject of the next two ecumenical councils, the third and fourth. The third council was called in the year 431 and met in the city of Ephesus, one of the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, and, like the first two councils, in the modern nation of Turkey. Of course, Turkey wasn't Turkey then. It was part of the Roman Empire because the Turks aren't around at this time. So, nevertheless, in Ephesus, here's the issue. A bishop of Constantinople named Nestorius had refused to accept the phrase that Mary is the mother of God. Okay, he would not accept that Mary is the mother of God. Of course, he would accept that Mary is the mother of Jesus. In other words, Mary is the mother of the human Jesus, but not of the divine Christ. And this was, for many Christians, a real problem because it seems to divide Jesus into two divisible parts. Here are some things we can say about Jesus the man, and here are some things we can say about Jesus the God, but what does that mean? It's almost as if it's two different entities we're talking about. And so in this council, the Nestorian position was rejected. Nestorians were declared wrong. And in fact, it's here that the church officially declares Mary to be the mother of God. By the way, although there's some dispute about this, it's perhaps as a result of this that the first church in Rome dedicated to the Virgin Mary, St. Mary Major, was built to celebrate the claim of the church now that Mary is the mother of God. I want to point out the Nestorians didn't go away any more than the Arians went away. Although they began to move outside the Roman Empire, first into Persia, and by 781 there are Nestorians in the middle of China, in the city of Jian today. In the 13th century, when Marco Polo went to China, he ran into Nestorians and found out that Kublai Khan's mother was a Nestorian Christian, for goodness sake. Since that time, the Nestorians have been much scattered, but there are still groups of Christians who claim to be Nestorians. There are no more Arians, but they claim to be Nestorians, although it's hard to trace their lineage directly because of their movements and their persecutions by various peoples. But the head of these Nestorians, or Neo-Nestorians, whatever we want to call them, actually did meet with Pope John Paul II. So they are engaged, at least in the broadest sense, in ecumenism. The Fourth Council, very important one, the one to which Pope Leo wrote, this tome, met in 451 in the city of Chalcedon. Chalcedon is an Asian suburb of Constantinople, or Istanbul. In other words, it's right across the water from Constantinople. You can see Chalcedon from Constantinople. And here again, the question is the relationship between Jesus' humanity and his divinity. There were theologians who thought the Council of Ephesus didn't go far enough. That in fact, they went so far as to say, these theologians, that Jesus had two natures, indeed, human and divine, but only the divine nature was complete. That some of what it means to be human, some of the characteristics we associate with being human, were not, in fact, part of Christ. So if you will, he had one complete nature and one partial nature. It was a real body. He wasn't a ghost. These are not the Martianites. But nevertheless, that Jesus was fully divine and had some human characteristics. And if you didn't buy that, they thought, you were at least a kind of crypto-Nestorian. Well, this position, called the Monophysite position, because that's a Greek word that means one nature, if you will, one complete nature, the Monophysites were condemned at the Council of Chalcedon. Though what the Council of Chalcedon says is that Christ had two complete natures, human and divine, woven together, sort of inextricably mixed together at the incarnation, and that Jesus is like us, humans, in all things save sin. Now, admittedly, save sin's a big one, but nevertheless, he is essentially and fully human, as well as essentially and fully divine. Well, the Monophysites didn't go away either. In fact, today, there are several old Christian communities that are Monophysite. The Copts in Egypt, the Ethiopians, and the Armenians are all Monophysite communities that therefore have been in some way separated from the main body of Christians since the 5th century, although there's a lot of work going on in our own time to sort of heal that 1,500-year-old plus division. Important to say. But if we go back to the 5th century itself, there were certain areas, in particular around Alexandria in Egypt, where Monophysites probably remained the majority of Christians. But almost all the strong Monophysite areas were conquered by Muslims in the 7th century. And so really, the Monophysite, and this is the way the emperor might see it, threat to true Christianity, small o Orthodox Christianity, was really only largely removed in the 7th century with the conquest of the southern Mediterranean and much of the eastern Mediterranean by Arab Muslims. So it's important to be aware of the fact that this problem continued to persist, this division persisted. Well, these four ecumenical councils, okay, to review, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, really drew up what now are the most central shared doctrines of most Christians. Again, Catholics, Orthodox, most Protestants accept the decrees of these four ecumenical councils. Now, obviously, later on, Protestants and Orthodox and Catholics add other things that are going to divide them, and there'll be non-doctrinal issues that divide them as well. But we need to be aware that sort of these fundamental issues, first about the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, and secondly, the relationship between Jesus' humanity and divinity, are largely hammered out in the 4th and 5th century by these imperially sponsored councils. And to go back to the beginning of the lecture, let's also remember that it's during the 4th and 5th centuries that we really begin to get a definition of the unique papal office, the office of the Bishop of Rome. And so it's the 4th and 5th centuries where so many other important Christian things happen that we also have the beginning of the definition of the papal office and the most fundamental Christian doctrines. In Greek. And so it's important.